And you said, so if you did some rudimentary maths about $100 per kilowatt hour, the cost of just the batteries to provide 7 days of energy storage for today's global energy use is over 300 trillion every 10 years. And that's within the lifespan of a battery. That's 30 trillion a year, literally more than a third of the entire annual income of the world. So not only does the technology not exist, but it's not financially viable, and it'll have no protection against blackouts, and it's still weather dependent. And that actually lines up somewhat as well. It was quite encouraging with some research that I did in 2021 that modeled, okay, what would happen if you just had the UK become entirely renewable by 2030, which is the new deadline with the, I would say, Labour government in waiting at this point, because the Conservatives have the exact same policy, but they're going to get voted out. It would take all battery manufacturing around the world to stop, 80% of which is done in China anyway, and they know that this tech isn't working, so I think that's they're exporting it to us for a reason. That would cost nearly 3 trillion, and that was before the inflation that's just hit, and then it would only meet 26.5% of energy demands without any protection against a blackout. So if we can do this modeling, my question is always, if we can knock these numbers about, why is it that every institution is marching in lockstep with terrible data and bunk policies? And you actually pointed out that as John Holdren was appointed chief scientific advisor to President Obama. That immediately just pricked up my ears of, okay, if there's so much bad data, so much bad policy, and the knowledge system won't listen to valid critics like yourself or Professor Peterson, then are the ears closed off deliberately, or is this all just a series of happy, stupid accidents that we've got to suffer?
Well, in terms of the just issue of the grid and with electricity, so the most recent numbers I ran I found interesting, which were you just take 3 days of storage, and so you're basically taking the whole world's energy use and like what kind of backup would you need? Now nobody really knows exactly because nobody is actually doing anything resembling having just solar and wind and battery backup because it's totally not economic, and that's really the issue. I stress this a lot in Fossil Future. It's not like, does the technology exist where you could do it at infinite cost? That's totally useless, except as a base for trying to make something cost effective. It's, can you do it in a way that's actually cost effective so people can benefit from it? And so I ran the numbers with Elon Musk in particular, because he keeps posting about, hey, a small little section of solar panels can power the world. You just need some batteries. You just need some megapacks. And so I said, okay, well, let's just say you need 3 days of storage, which is pretty conservative because like you have all kinds of seasonal variations. But let's just say 3 days of backup. And I ran the numbers. I went to his website and I got the best prices on megapacks. And if you take those numbers, it was actually $590 trillion to back up the world for 3 days. And he keeps posting this and I keep responding, and more people are asking him, hey, like, why can't you respond to what Alex is saying? So if people watching this, you should check out the latest things I've been posting and encourage Elon at some point. I've never seen him actually engage something that was critical of him and right, but maybe this will be the first time. So then, then the other question is, about the knowledge system, I think. And so this is what I call the set of institutions that we rely on to give us expert knowledge and guidance. And what I try to highlight in the book is that this system is clearly a failed system. It's clearly denying the benefits of fossil fuels in general. It's clearly, I only indicated this so far, but it's denying what I call the climate mastery benefits of fossil fuels. So our ability to master climate. You can't look at climate danger without looking at our ability to deal with it. And so if our ability to deal with it is 50 or 100 times greater than it used to be, you have to factor that in. You have to recognize, well, we're so good at dealing with the naturally dangerous climate. Well, why should we be afraid of anything other than a total difference in kind, radical change to climate? That's not 1 or 2 or 3 degrees. So there's really not the reason to be afraid that people think. And then there's this tendency to what I call catastrophize side effects, which you mentioned John Holdren, who was appointed to be chief science advisor of Obama. And yet this guy, we used to speculate that we'd have up to 1 billion climate-related disaster deaths by 2020, which has already passed, due to famine from CO2, which didn't make much sense because CO2 is plant food. But you just see that there's something very, very wrong with this system, and there are different kinds of motives. But I think one thing to your question that's clear is this is not a system that is interested in correcting its mistakes.
Definitely not. And it's interesting as well because the modeling that you've done to refute Elon's claim that it's affordable, the modeling I did was based on Tesla's Hornsdale facility in Australia. So it seems that we've come across similar threads here of, I'm sure as well that, not to disparage Mr. Musk, but if you keep pushing for renewables and all of these minerals that you need to build your electric cars and this new system, it will give you lots of money for your space race to go up and mine asteroids. But that's just my thoughts on that. The other interesting thing as well was that in Chapter 11, you hit upon something that has been percolating around, at least finally, the Republican legislature in America, but that's something that we've been talking about for quite a while, is the ESGs. They finally got a mention. What are your thoughts on how the West is bifurcating into the renewables only global governance mode, stewarded by businesses and international bodies, versus BRICS specifically, because the Chinese and the Russians, and they're all hoarding oil and gold, and it looks like we're being left out in the cold.
Mm-hmm. Wait, okay, so there's the ESG, and then what's the other element of it?
BRICS, obviously. So we're cutting ourselves off at the knees with renewables with ESG scores, versus BRICS, which is Russia, China, India. They're all consolidating oil and gas and gold, and they're doing the sensible thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think of ESG as what it really is at its core is it's a set of business policies that are trying to get businesses, instead of focusing on long-term value creation, to focus on enacting in various ways left-wing political ideas. I think it really sees businesses as vessels for cultural and political ideas, almost always left wing, that somebody wants. And it really has been a brilliant strategy, because often what you're able to do is you get companies to do and support things that voters would not support. So for example, all these net zero by 2050 things, like voters don't vote for that, certainly not in the US. And voters get mad when gasoline prices go up, whereas these companies are just, and also financial institutions are just saying gung ho, yeah, get rid of as much fossil fuel use as possible. They support things like carbon taxes. They in effect support much higher fossil fuel prices, including oil prices, coal prices, natural gas prices. So it's these institutions, this under ESG, it's been incredibly effective because they've been able to expand their political movement and use all the resources of business to just further that in all sorts of ways. And so what you have is a much more holistic and consistent commitment by historically the freer parts of the world to make themselves less free, and specifically to gut themselves in the material realm, and then just totally depend on usually much less free countries, particularly China and Russia. So this is just very ominous. And ESG in many ways, I've thought for years, has been the scariest thing to me, because it's one thing to say, hey, I've got to convince voters to reject a lot of this stuff and think differently. But then it's a different thing to say, I've got to convince status seeking corporate and investment types, because often they don't have very healthy incentives, because often they have status incentives, and status incentives often are consistent with whatever the mainstream view is. And the mainstream view is really bad. And I think right now voters in the US tend to have much more accurate views about energy than the mainstream intellectuals. So it's really scary to see all this money and power rallying behind these terrible mainstream views, and including a lot of that money and power is going toward manipulating citizens into giving up fossil fuels. So it's a real threat.
Yeah, it's kind of an enforcement mechanism to have an ideological monopoly among the market, and especially with the increasing digitization of everything from gas stoves in America to gas cars everywhere now, to the entire grid. And
gas cars or electric cars?
They're trying to in 2030 in the UK, they're trying to ban gas cars entirely.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. So, and obviously in the UK as well, by the end of this year, they're ascribing us a social credit score by importing a digital ID in, and they're doing central bank digital currencies. And obviously, they're also developing a For Climate app funded by the government, which suggests new ways that you can lower your personal carbon allowance. I'm sure those won't all get homogenized into one app eventually. My question is, okay, if we have all of these obvious proofs, and the everyday working man and woman can see this about, it's very expensive. It's not at all cost effective. There's no long-term strategy for adopting the technology. In the UK, if we drilled in the North Sea for 10% of its reserves, it'd have enough energy for 50 years. It just seems like common sense. Yet none of the elites, self-appointed in business or government, seem to want to go along with this. My question is, why have they been so swept up and captured by this narrative if the evidence obviously disproves it?
It's a good question. I think one thing that happens is once a view reaches a certain level of status in the culture, then you have there's a lot of positive feedback loops. Now, I don't mean morally positive. I just mean that the thing gets reinforced. And I think this has definitely happened with what I call the moral monopoly of the climate catastrophe / fossil fuel elimination movement, where it's just been like at a certain point, it got like to the point where it was just considered totally evil to oppose it. And they cleverly positioned it as both evil and unscientific to oppose it, and as morally great and scientific to support it. And I think a lot of it was, I mean, there are a bunch of different dynamics I talk about in chapter 11 of Fossil Future. They were able to effectively, falsely, but effectively frame the debate as either you are a climate change believer, by which that means you believe we have some impact on climate and you're against fossil fuels, or you're a quote climate change denier and then fossil fuels are okay. So they totally just got rid of the idea, or never considered the idea, that, hey, you could believe that we have some climate impact and still think that the benefits of fossil fuels are far more significant than any negatives of that climate impact. Just like you could decide that, hey, a prescription drug is really overall good, even if it has some side effects, including negative side effects. And I think that was really effective in terms of just helping get the monopoly. Another thing was just taking over the educational system. I think the environmental left since the 60s and particularly 70s really saw it as a focus to focus on schools, which is very clever, because when you focus on schools, then you get all the institutions at some point, because all the institutions are fed by the basic educational institutions. I think they're very good at co-opting the UN. I mentioned with ESG, they're very good at co-opting business. It's been really good. You can think of it as it's a new religion that's had a very clever strategy. But then it poses as secular and scientific. So in some sense, it has much more power than a regular religion, because a regular religion often people see as, okay, well, some people have faith in this, but others don't. And so not everyone has to do it. And you need freedom to not do certain things from it. But in this case, it's no, it's a religion. It's actually a religion, but it's portrayed as science. And so everyone needs to do it. So it's been a really brilliant thing that they've pulled off. I mean, my focus has been just really clearly challenge the thinking, which I don't think had been done clearly enough, and then offer a good way of thinking, and then do a lot of strategic stuff to spread it. Like I have a website, energytalkingpoints.com, and that takes all of my points and makes them available freely to everybody in bite-sized pieces that you can use on Twitter and everywhere else. And a lot of politicians have started using these. I do a lot of different things strategically, but I think the core thing is just being really clear, making really clear to a typical person that the thinking method of the mainstream makes no sense, and that there's a much better thinking method that leads to a very different position.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.